Hey, this is Jeff Ratcliffe here. Let's talk about the value in daily fantasy for a minute. The big prizes, yeah, they're attractive, but you have to finish in the top 2% out of thousands of experts to win any real money. So even on your best day, you still feel like you're losing. Now you can play something better. StatHero. StatHero is a house-based game that combines the best of daily fantasy and survivor pools. Each StatHero contest lasts multiple days, but requires only one entry fee, so your money lasts longer. Yes, you can play multiple days with only one entry fee. StatHero gives you smaller contests and more chances to win, and no more competing with sharks or experts ever, because your only competition is StatHero itself. Survive the game and download StatHero today and see how the face of daily fantasy has changed. Finally, a game designed for the rest of us. StatHero now open for NFL and NBA. For more information, please visit StatHero.com. What is up? It's the Pro Football Focus Fantasy Podcast. My name's Jeff Ratcliffe, and it's Thursday, December 26th. Yeah, baby. We're back. One day off. All right, Belichick, one day off. But otherwise, we're back in the saddle here. It's Week 17 fantasy football. Of course, this is a week to take it easy. I don't like having a fantasy championship this week for obvious reasons. Lamar Jackson, for example, not playing this week. And a lot of moving parts throughout the league. But it's a great week for gambling. It's a great week for DFS. So, of course, we will set you up for all of that. And then let's not forget, next week we have fantasy drafts and contests starting for the NFL playoffs. Love playing fantasy in the NFL playoffs. So, of course, we'll set you up there as well. And, hey, Rookie Talk is coming up soon, too. Before we dive into today's topics, I have to say a little humble brag here. The accuracy competitions have finalized here. They run through 16 weeks for rankings purposes. And, we finished, and by we, I mean I did. I finished 8th at Fantasy Pros this year and 4th at the new Fantasy Nation rankings accuracy competition. So, it was a pretty good year. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Pretty good year. You're too kind. That was a nice year for us. Hopefully that helped everybody out. If you're listening to this pod, hopefully helped you to a fantasy championship as well. 8th place, pretty solid. Happy with it, but we got to keep working to get better for next year for you as well. But anyway, I want to dive into the topics today. So today, we have this one opportunity here, really. I mean, we're going to do a lot of looking back over the course of the offseason, but while everything's very fresh, to take a look back at the season that was and try and understand, make sense of what we just saw here in 2019 fantasy football. And also, we're going to look forward as well. So we're looking back, looking forward on the pod today. The first thing I want to do, though, you may have seen this post over at PFF.com, but I did a post on what we learned for fantasy purposes here in 2019. Run through some of these really quickly here. I mean, first and foremost, the big thing that we learned, the NFL, it's a passing league. There is no doubt about it. And we did see some teams that have gone decidedly run heavy. Seattle, Baltimore, even the Patriots to some degree have been very run-heavy teams recently, but it is a passing league. Michael Thomas, not only did he set the record for receptions, this guy did so in 15 games, which is very important for us. Sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle, and I know I've done this in the past as well. But when we talk about fantasy performances, like say I'm in July and I'm talking about last year's performance, we tend to do so looking at all 16 games, all 17 weeks of the NFL season. But obviously, as I just said, we really shouldn't be playing in Week 17. So does Week 17, should that be a factor when we look back? There's arguments for and against, obviously. But regardless, for Michael Thomas's purposes, he did this. He set the record in 15 games. He set the record over the course of a regular fantasy season, excluding Week 17. So impressive. On top of that, when you look at the fantasy production, 366.9 PPR points, that is the highest that we've seen. I mean, really the highest we've seen recently was in 2015. Julio Jones had 347. So Thomas is like a whole game higher. And what I love about Michael Thomas is he's kind of like the anti-Mike Evans in that Mike Evans has an enormous fantasy ceiling, but he has an extraordinarily low fantasy floor, like literally a 0-point fantasy floor. That can happen from Mike Evans. And then the next week, he can go out and have 150 yards and 3 touchdowns on 7 catches or whatever, right? Michael Thomas doesn't have that. He doesn't have the enormous ceiling. He has a nice ceiling. I'm not trying to say he doesn't, but he doesn't have the enormous ceiling. But his floor is so freaking high. I don't remember ever seeing a floor like this. Like, there were times where Antonio Brown, sure, his floor was pretty darn high, but he was also a guy who, really relied on that big-time ceiling. And towards the end of his run there with Pittsburgh, it was a very touchdown dependent. Thomas isn't touchdown dependent. Thomas doesn't get targeted downfield. Thomas is really getting targeted basically like a slot receiver, but he doesn't score like one. He has that obviously elite fantasy ceiling. It's pretty incredible what we saw this season, the efficiency, all of that. But it wasn't just Thomas, it was Christian McCaffrey as well. He broke the single season receptions record for running backs, also like Thomas, doing so in 15 games, not 16. And oh, by the way, yes, he held that record from last year. Unbelievable there. We'll see if he joins the 1,000 club this week. But the 446 PPR points, the most we've seen in nearly 2 decades. The highest we had seen before this through 15 games, first 16 weeks of the season, was David Johnson, 404.8. So McCaffrey just blew that out of the water. He was basically like starting 2 players this season. And he did so on a team that pretty much fell apart. A team that early in the season, I thought the defense looked pretty good. The defense ended up not being good. You can run all over them. Alvin Kamara, I'm looking at you this week. But the defense fell apart. Cam Newton, that whole debacle, the whole thing where they were trying to make the proverbial shine with Kyle Allen, and a lot of people were buying into that. And it didn't matter for Christian McCaffrey. He just kept producing. So amazing. Pass-heavy league. But what's so fascinating about this pass-heavy league, another thing that we learned, with quarterbacks, running is more important than it has ever been in fantasy football. So while we want a quarterback who can certainly pass, he's got to be able to run as well. And when you look at this year's top 10 in fantasy scoring, so I'll run through them in order. It's Lamar, Deshaun, Jameis, Dak, Russell Wilson, Josh Allen, Mahomes, Kyler, Wentz, and Matt Ryan. That's through the first 15 weeks. Of those guys, there are only 2 who also didn't rank top 10 at the position in rushing yards. The 2 are Patrick Mahomes, who obviously missed a little bit of time. He finished 13th in rushing yards, so he very likely may have cracked the top 10 if he played every game. He missed 2 games. The other is Matt Ryan, and he finished right at the fringe. He was finished 10th in fantasy scoring. He was 19th in rushing yards. So, in other words, obviously running is very, very important. Now, let's compare that to a decade ago. 2009 fantasy scoring. Ready? A little blast from the past for you here. Here's the top 10. Aaron Rodgers, Breeze, Matt Schaub was 3rd, Peyton Manning, Brett Favre, Tony Romo, Tom Brady, Big Ben, Phil Rivers, Eli Manning. That's your top 10 in 2009. Of that group, only 1 of them ranked in the top 10 in rushing yards, and only 2 of them in the top 20 in rushing yards among quarterbacks. Aaron Rodgers was 2nd among quarterbacks in rushing yards. Obviously, he finished 1st overall. The only other to crack the top 20 was Tony Romo. He was 17th. The number 1 rushing quarterback ended up finishing 14th in fantasy scoring that year was David Garrard. And he didn't have a lot of rushing yards, by the way. Peyton Manning, who finished 4th at the position in fantasy scoring, had negative 13 rushing yards. Negative 13! So you look at this, obviously, the league is changing. It is becoming a more pass-heavy league, but it's a league that's relying on these mobile quarterbacks, and these mobile quarterbacks are producing fantasy points with their legs. I mean, you look at it, think about it. I said this numerous times on this pod. If you've heard it before, well, you're going to hear it again. Every 40 rushing yards is the same amount of fantasy points as a passing touchdown in most scoring systems. So when you're Lamar Jackson and you have over 1,200 rushing yards, you produce the same amount of fantasy points with your legs as it would have taken for Peyton Manning in 2009 to throw 30 touchdown passes to produce. Just with his legs, it's the same amount of fantasy points. Now, that's the extreme example, but if a quarterback hits, say, 400 rushing yards, that is 10 passing touchdowns worth of production. In 2009, I think it would have been unheard of, and the league was changing already. That was that transitional period from 2000, mid-2000s, like 2003, 2004, 2005, till the end of that decade. That was a transitional period where we started to see more and more and more and more passing. But it would have been unheard of in 2009 for a quarterback to finish as a top 10 option and not throw at least 20 passing scores. Kyler Murray did that this year. You have guys like Josh Allen. Josh Allen is not the best passing quarterback. He has a cannon, don't get me wrong, but he's not the best passing quarterback. And he goes out there and finishes third at the position in rushing yards, first at the position in rushing touchdowns, finishes sixth in fantasy scoring. Even somebody like Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston is not a running quarterback, right? He still finished eighth at the position in rushing yards. Rushing yards are important for quarterbacks. We need to keep track of that. We need to pay attention to that. We need to be drafting these modern fantasy quarterbacks, not the old guard who just stand there and throw the football. Late round quarterback is alive and well. Shout out to JJ Zacharyson on that one. But this year, I think every year, there's going to be guys who are going to be overdrafted at the position. Patrick Mahomes was that guy this year. Every single year there's a guy who's overdrafted. And it's not a knock on Mahomes. Even if Mahomes was fully healthy the entire season, he would have been overdrafted where he went in the second round. Drafting a quarterback that early is a waste. It's a complete waste. Because ultimately, you think about it, the difference between the number one fantasy quarterback and any guy you could pick up off of waivers is nowhere near as significant as the number one fantasy running back and a guy you could pick off of waivers, or even the running back who you're picking where you're supposed to be, or where you ended up picking Patrick Mahomes, even that running back and who you pick up off of waivers. The difference there is staggering. The difference. Same thing with wide receiver. So you have that. You also have the potential that your draft capital you spent on a second round pick doesn't pan out. You don't get a return on investment. It's really hard to do that. He would have had to repeat a historic season for you to get return on investment. And that is, well, there's a reason why it's a historic season. Remember that with Lamar Jackson next year, by the way. Meanwhile, if you look at the top six, let's just run through the top six here. Ready? Top six in fantasy scoring. Lamar, Deshaun, Jameis, Dak, Wilson, Allen. Okay, none of them named Patrick Mahomes. Maybe he would have been a top. He would have been a top six if he would have played the whole season. But regardless, Jackson, widely taken in the 10th round. Same with Jameis Winston. They were late round guys. Dak Prescott was a 12th round pick. Josh Allen may have still been on the board in the 15th round. 4 of the top 6 fantasy quarterbacks were late round quarterbacks this year. And I always recommend that approach to drafting, the safe and upside. I know a lot of people will say don't draft 2 quarterbacks. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think you draft 2 quarterbacks if you have a plan in place. And my safe and upside plan is you draft a safe guy, Phillip Rivers, Tom Brady, blah, blah, blah. Safe, but not much ceiling. But at least they're not going to lose you games if you miss on your upside guy. Jameis Winston. I had a lot of Jameis this year. I didn't get enough of Lamar because I think the buzz got out just a little too much, and he crept up into the early part of the 10th round, and I should have anticipated it. Lesson learned there. But regardless, Jameis Winston, I did take some Dak Prescott in some places. I didn't get any Josh Allen this year because I typically found that I was drafting a quarterback a little bit earlier than Josh Allen, but also another one, lesson learned, where maybe we should also be looking at the very, very back end of quarterbacks likely to be drafted. Regardless, the plan is simple. If you drafted Phillip Rivers and you drafted Lamar Jackson, well, you knew relatively quickly Lamar Jackson was the real deal for fantasy purposes. Only took a little bit. And I always recommend about a month, that first month of the season, September, to see what you have on your hands, right? Anyway, if you had that, by the time we got to early October, you could easily have cut Phillip Rivers loose, sent him to waivers, didn't matter, use that roster spot to pick somebody up, because you're always going to need a roster spot, right? If you whiffed on, say you didn't do that, say you went Phillip Rivers or Tom Brady and Mitchell Trubisky. Let's do that one. Tom Brady and Mitchell Trubisky. You got to October, it didn't look like it was happening. You could cut Mitchell Trubisky loose. Now you have Tom Brady. He's not going to win you weeks, but I don't think he's going to lose you a ton of weeks. It was an okay season for fantasy purposes out of Brady. And then you're able to work the wire, and you're keeping an eye on upside guys. Maybe you're able to grab Mitchell Trubisky. Maybe you had some Danny Dimes in there at times. You know, you start streaming, and I always talk about churning. Like, churning is an idea where you're essentially streaming until you hit, and you may never hit. You know, it's an idea that I used to use a lot in IDP. I'm still in a couple IDP leagues, but not as much as I used to be. But, you know, safety, churn at safety, and then you land on, you know, like a John Johnson before he got hurt or something like that. You know, a guy who kind of comes out of the woodwork and then starts putting up big numbers. That is very similar to quarterback. You could have churned and then landed on Tannehill, and then boom, you had Tannehill. And if you had Tannehill, you rode him straight on through the season, right? That can work as well. So that's, I think, the safe and upside is a sort of variation with the late round approach idea central to it that can really work next year. We also learned to beware of aging running backs. Man, oh man, Mark Ingram is the exception, not the rule. I think David Johnson may be the extreme example, but whoa. So, with David Johnson, he was widely drafted as the 5th running back off the board, which typically put him as either the 5th or 6th pick overall. If a wide receiver, DeAndre Hopkins, went before him, then he was the 6th pick overall. And there was a hype train as well, right? People were hyping him up because of the Cliff Kingsbury offense. So we got a decent start, right? We got a decent start for fantasy purposes. First 6 weeks of the season, he was the number 6 fantasy running back. So basically pretty much kind of where you had hoped he would be. And that's why everything that unfolded after that point was so shocking for people, right? He gets hurt. All right, people get hurt. But then, boom, team trades for Kenyon Drake. Johnson's back. Drake's way ahead of Johnson. Drake goes on to do exactly what a lot of folks had hoped David Johnson would do in that offense. And David Johnson was pretty much a non-factor, unstartable, despite being healthy in the fantasy stretch run, fantasy playoffs, etc. Now, the thing is, if we looked a little bit closer, and we did on this show, remember, you can go back to the tape, go way back. It might have been early October when I talked about this. Johnson was doing okay as a receiver, no doubt about that. But as a runner, 298 rushing yards on 76 carries. That was 3.92 per carry over that first 6 weeks. 1.99 yards after contact per attempt over that span. Now, you look at what Kenyon Drake did since joining the team. 5.3 yards per carry, 2.88 yards after contact per attempt. That's not a big number, but it's close to 3, and that's all that matters to me. If you're below 2 in yards after contact per attempt, you are not doing your job as a running back, creating independent of your blocking. The writing was on the wall for this, is what I'm trying to say. And also, he was 27 entering the season. He was not the only 27-year-old running back to disappoint, because Le'Veon Bell certainly did as well. And I would even say to a lesser degree, Devontae Freeman, despite his nice little finish to the season here, he was a disappointment for a good chunk of the year. And yes, he was banged up, but even without the injury, he was still a disappointment. I think we really need to pay close attention to how old these guys are, especially when they're getting close to that 27-year-old plateau, that range. Melvin Gordon next year, I'm looking at you, by the way. Either way, just be careful with that. It's something that isn't just a dynasty concept. Tight end, if you've listened to this podcast, you know it really annoys me how inconsistent it is, except for Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, George Kittle this year. You drafted them high. They certainly paid off. No problems with those 3. But when you look at the top 10 options, only 5 of the top 10 tight ends who were drafted that way finished that way. And 3 of the top 10 finishers were probably undrafted. Now, Darren Waller may have been drafted. Depends on how savvy your league is. He did go undrafted in a lot of leagues, though. He was picked up, very early in the season. He was the number 4 fantasy tight end. Dallas Goedert was not drafted unless you live in Philadelphia, and even there, I highly doubt he was drafted. He finished 8th. Tyler Higbee, of course, was not drafted. He finished 9th at the position. And his whole thing as well, moving from number 35 all the way up to 9, he's going to finish as a top 10 in yards at the position after basically not being used for the whole season. It just shows you. And then beyond that, the whole notion here of whether the tight end scores a touchdown, basically defining whether it's a good or bad week. Like, think about it. 3 for 32. We talk about it all the time. 3 for 32 in a PPR, that's 6.2 points, right? 3 for 32, 6.2 points. 3 for 32 in a touchdown, 12.2 points. So you're telling me that because he scored a touchdown, he is now twice as good as 3 for 32 without a touchdown? I don't know. That's just something that doesn't necessarily sit well with me. And I think the question, you can't really argue for a change in scoring tight ends, but do we really want to reward that one play with so many points? Is a 3 for 32 and a touchdown player really twice as good as a 3 for 32 and no touchdown player? I think that's the question we have to ask, and I don't know if there's an answer to that. Finally, team defense scoring. I've talked about this before as well. It's completely antiquated. It is silly, and it is extremely touchdown dependent. I mean, just think about how we score. It's not in line with the rest of fantasy football. You earn points for accumulating stats, and you have minor penalties for turnovers, right? For interceptions, for fumbles lost at the other positions. But with defense, you start with points, and then you lose points as the opposing team scores. And it doesn't matter if they score against the defense or not. And then you accumulate small amounts of points for sacks and takeaways. But really, the only way you score a lot of points as a defense is if you score touchdowns. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers this year allowed the third most points per game and finished as the number 4 fantasy defense because they scored 5 freaking touchdowns. That's not, I think, what we're trying to accomplish here with fantasy football. And I know, hey, the scoring system is the way it is because it goes all the way back to an era where people had to hand tabulate. People had to literally go to the USA Today and write things down. So the scoring systems were very simple. In that era, there were a lot of leagues who just did touchdown only. And you just got points for touchdowns because it was really easy to tabulate those stats. We don't have to worry about that today. We don't have to worry at all. Commissioner sites are so good in this era. Even if you don't like the one you play on, it's a lot better than having Joe Schmo tabulate your stats from the newspaper, right? A lot better. So at this point, it just doesn't seem like we're rewarding for defensive play. We're rewarding for defenses who are able to find the end zone the most, which is it's very, very random. There's high variance year over year in terms of touchdowns scored by a defense, right? They're random plays. I think as an industry, we need to come up with a better way to score defenses, more reflective of what's happening on the field, less influenced by touchdowns. And I'm not saying eliminate touchdowns, but I'm just saying we're stuck in the Stone Ages with team defense. And if we do that, team defense will become a lot more predictive. And I think it would ultimately end up increasing the value of the position so that it isn't just you have to stream it position. We'll see if we get some work done on that in the offseason. But anyway, I want to switch over really quickly here to a brief look at my 2020 rankings. We unveiled these over at PFF.com today, the way too early. I don't think they're way too early, to be honest with you, but that's just what everybody says. Because, hey, 2020 is 6 days away, so it's not that early. But we have to get thinking about this, and you might be thinking, well, why are you thinking about this? Well, hey, best ball drafts are a little over a month away. We have to be thinking about this now. And if we don't start thinking now, we're going to be behind. And hey, I don't like to be behind. I want to get ahead of this stuff and really start to see what 2020 is going to look like for us. So I put these together. Please go check them out, pff.com. You don't have to be a subscriber to look at these. And I know that, hey, rankings are not a perfect science by any means. I know you're going to agree with some and disagree with others. So, of course, you can let us know about that. On Twitter, I'm at Jeff Ratcliffe. And, of course, you can follow along at PFF_fantasy. But I just want to roll through a couple players here. Not going to do the whole 150. But a couple players that really, stand out. Well, I mean, we'll do the top 10 for you, and then we'll go from there. So at 1, I think it's pretty obvious. It's Christian McCaffrey. I don't even need to tell you why. I mean, this is going to be one of those years where, yes, if you have the number 1 pick, there's no doubt in what you're going to do. And I think that's true even in 2 quarterback leagues, by the way. More on that in a second. Michael Thomas comes in at 2. I was tempted to put a running back there, but the more that I looked at it, as I mentioned earlier, it's not only the high ceiling that he has, but it's that enormous floor that I don't think there's I don't think there's an argument to be made Thomas over McCaffrey, but I also don't necessarily think there's a safer pick on the board than Michael Thomas. So he comes in at 2. I have Saquon at 3. I mean, I do expect the Giants to look better in 2020, and I do expect a bounce back season, and hopefully he avoids injury, because I think if he didn't get hurt there, I don't think the sentiment would be exactly the same as it is right now. Because once he was really healthy, and he said, I'm fully healthy at the end of the season, he said that a couple weeks ago, he looked like himself. I mean, he was phenomenal. So you get Saquon at 3. That's maybe a little bit of a value. We're going Zeke at 4, the volume. He's still on the right side of 27. So I think this will be, if he's one of those guys that does start to wear down at 27, this may be one of the last big years we get out of him, but I do think it is going to be a big year. He's had a lot of volume over his career, by the way. Dalvin Cook coming in at 5. Love the breakout season. Love the scheme for him. Alvin Kamara at 6. There's some debate as to whether or not Alvin Kamara is going to slide out of the first round. I don't think it happens, because I think there's going to be a lot of folks like me who end up ranking him in this range so that he gets drafted in the first round. And it's really just about touchdown productivity, which, again, we can see swings year over year. I'm not really worried about that part. DeAndre Hopkins at 7. I think that people are going to overlook that this was still a pretty decent season for Hopkins. So he comes in at 7. Tyreek Hill and his enormous ceiling, if he stays healthy, if Mahomes stays healthy, again, we have a probably very different perspective on him, coming in at 8. Nick Chubb at 9. Man, this guy, we're right in his wheelhouse now. We're right in the wheelhouse of his career, and I do expect the Browns to improve next season offensively, and a lot of that offense is going to flow through him. And then Mike Evans at 10. Now, I know that people love to hate Mike Evans. The thing about it is, before he got hurt, he was a top 3 fantasy receiver. People were complaining about his season, and he was a top 3 fantasy receiver. Let's just think through that. I mean, hey, he's essentially a lock for 1,000+ yards if he stays healthy. He has an enormous ceiling. We know he's volatile, but my old saying now, I guess it is an old saying at this point, if you don't like him, don't draft him. That's all. Doesn't matter what my rankings say. If you don't like him, don't draft him, because no matter what he does, you aren't going to like it. If he has a great week, you're going to say, yeah, but wait till next week when he goes for, 1 catch for 5 yards. And then the next week when he goes 1 catch for 5 yards, you're like, see, I told you, he stinks. Just don't draft him. If you don't like the player, don't put yourself through that. Just don't draft him. It doesn't matter what Jeff Ratcliffe's rankings say. Some other guys who I think are drawing some attention. So at 12, I have Derrick Henry at 11, then Joe Mixon at 12. The reason why I have Joe Mixon at 12, and I've been pointing this out in a lot of my work recently, he has finished so well that I think the team actually continues to feed him as we spill into 2020. It's actually very similar to Derrick Henry in a lot of ways. The team figured out how to use him in December last year, and then that continued into this year. Well, I think we'll see that with Joe Mixon next year. It's going to be a very different looking team. Obviously, quarterback is the big difference there for Cincinnati in 2020. But I think they're going to continue to feed him, and I like him in that range right now. Moving down a little bit, I have the 2 tight ends. I have Kelsey still ahead of Kittle, but it's pretty close between the two. Kelsey's at 17. Kittle is at 20. In between those guys, I have Josh Jacobs at 18, RB 10 for me. He was number 11 fantasy running back through the first 3 months of the season this year. The team looks like it's really starting to, have this positive culture. His arrow's pointing up. They love to feed him as well. Going down a little bit further, OBJ comes in at 24, Juju at 23, back-to-back there at the end of the second round. Guys may be overlooked, these guys. Juju will benefit from Ben being back, and this season, I think we just write it off. Same thing with Beckham, though. I think we somewhat write this off, provided the Browns figure it out, and I do think he's still on the Browns next year. They got to figure out how to use him more effectively. And really, that means getting him downfield a lot more often, targeting him heavily downfield. But, hey, if you take him as a 10th wide receiver, you're on that turn. You started with McCaffrey. You could have OBJ, and then, there's still interesting receivers down here. I think that's pretty interesting anyway. Moving on. So Lamar Jackson, obviously, is a hot topic. So I ended up putting him at 30. So here's the rationale. I think he is a 3rd-round pick when all is said and done. Do I think that's where he gets drafted? No. I think in a lot of home leagues, in fact, people are going to end up drafting him in the first round. In your traditional 10 or 12 team home leagues, he's going to be a back end first round pick. I really think so. In industry drafts, mock drafts, I think he ends up ultimately being a second round pick when we get into the heart of fantasy mock draft season. So you're talking May, June, July. I think that there are going to be some industry pundits who do take him in the second round. I don't think that's where he ultimately is valued. I think he is a third round pick. And it's not a knock on him. It's just, A, he's coming off a historic season. It's hard to replicate that. See Patrick Mahomes from last year. B, the gap between him and guys who you can draft in the late rounds, I don't think is significant enough to draft him in the second or first round. So I ultimately have him coming in there at 30. A couple other players of note, some guys that I had to go back. I made sure I went through the injured reserve to make sure I added everybody back in. Kerryon Johnson coming in as my 18th running back. Darius Geis, 23. I might be high on Geis now. I'm looking at it. But, man, he was so effective when he was on the field. So I think it was, in some ways a little bit of a statement I'll try and make with these early rankings. Like, this dude could be a breakout in 2020. Like, if he stays healthy, which obviously can he? I don't know. But he could be a big-time breakout, no doubt about it. Patrick Mahomes is my second quarterback, comes in at 59. He's going to be a value at 59. He's going to be a value. Patrick Mahomes. I'm going to get some shares of Patrick Mahomes this year, hopefully. Anyway, I mentioned the two quarterback thing. Where do I think Lamar Jackson should go in two quarterback leagues? As of right now, I think 3. I do. That's how high I am. I may change I almost certainly will change my tune between now and August. But even between now and after the Super Bowl, maybe I change my tune a little bit. But I think I still go McCaffrey, Thomas, and then, I don't think he's overvalued there in two quarterback leagues. So there you have that. A couple other quick thoughts here. I did get some people pushing back on A.J. Brown. I have A.J. Brown ranked 30th among wide receivers. He's 62 overall, which means, this is a guy who's like basically a top. He's on the edge of being in the 5th round. I don't think that's low at all. I think that's actually, pretty high, reasonably. Or maybe it's just a reasonable ranking. But I don't want to just have recency bias here and just expect him to be like a top 10 guy going forward. I just don't see that happening. David Johnson, I ranked him at 73. He's the 31st running back in rankings. I had such a hard time with this one because, see, his contract situation suggests he's going to be in Arizona next year. And if he's in Arizona, I have Kenyon Drake way ahead of him. I have him as the 15th running back at 32 overall. If that's the case, then, yeah, David Johnson I'm too high on. But if he lands somewhere else, now keep in mind he'll be 28, but if he lands somewhere else, could he put together like an RB2 season? Could he be like a top 25 guy? Yes, he certainly could, especially with his ability as a pass catcher. Anyway, a lot of thoughts here on 2020. So just do me a favor, stop by PFF.com, go to the fantasy section, and check out these rankings. It's a really basic, it's a quick post to read, and I give you some of my thoughts, but we'd also love to hear yours as well. Again, on Twitter at Jeff Ratcliffe and on Instagram at Jeff Ratcliffe. All right, so that's going to wrap it up for today. We'll be back tomorrow with another pod. Tomorrow we're going to dive in and break down all the things we normally break down. On a Friday, we'll break down some matchups for you and really have a DFS slant to it for tomorrow's episode of the pod. All right, looking forward to it. So I will catch you on the flip side for another edition of the podcast. For PFF, I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, and I'm out of here.